When the county inspector pulled up to the end of Hadley Road on a Tuesday morning in April, he expected 15 minutes of paperwork and a condemnation signature. The file on his clipboard described a former county jail abandoned since 1994, purchased at tax auction for $6 by a woman named Margaret Holloway. The satellite image showed a stone rectangle surrounded by weeds. The last inspection note, dated 1997, read, "Structure deteriorating, recommend demolition." He parked his white sedan, stepped out, and looked at what was in front of him. The building was still there. That much matched the file. 2 stories of grey limestone with barred windows on every side, and a roof that appeared not only intact but recently patched. A fire escape ran down the east wall steel and wood bolted into the stone with welds that even from the parking area looked clean. A garden wall enclosed the rear yard, and above it he could see the green tops of something growing in rows. A wooden sign near the entrance read, "All welcome," in hand-painted letters. The front door was open. He walked up the steps. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-70s, with silver hair pulled back and hands that looked like they belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime gripping tools. Beside her, a man about the same age, thin, upright, with reading glasses pushed onto his forehead, and the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting for people to catch up. Behind them in the corridor, 3 more figures stood watching. A young man with a toddler on his hip, an elderly woman in a hand-knitted sweater, a teenage girl leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her chin raised, as if daring the inspector to find something wrong. The woman in the doorway extended her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, and her crooked left index finger bent at an angle that suggested an old break that had never been properly set. She introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, and the man beside her as her husband Henry. She welcomed him to their home. The inspector shook her hand, looked at his clipboard, looked at the building behind her, and realized that whatever he had driven out here expecting this was not it. But before the inspector, before the fire escape and the garden, and the sign before the open door, and the people standing behind it, there were 2 suitcases on a motel curb and a black SUV pulling away without looking back. And before that, there was a life. Margaret Holloway, who had never been called Margaret by anyone except the IRS and her late mother. During arguments, had been Maggie since the day she was born in a clapboard house on the east side of a town that no longer existed in any meaningful way. The town had dried up around a closed textile mill in the 1980s, but Maggie had left long before that at 17, with a carpentry apprenticeship in a county where people were still building things. She learned framing first, then floors, then roofing cabinetry finish work. Load-bearing walls, the particular mathematics of making a structure stand up and stay standing. She was the only woman on every crew she joined for the first 12 years, and she survived not by demanding respect, but by outworking every man on the scaffold until respect became irrelevant. What mattered was whether your joints were tight, your cuts were clean, and your walls were plumb. Maggie's walls were always plumb. 42 years she spent building houses for other people. Her hands recorded every one of those years. The right palm carried a scar from a circular saw that had kicked back during a kitchen remodel in 1978. The left index finger had broken in 1981 when a joist slipped during a second-story addition, and she had set it herself with tape and a popsicle stick. Because taking a day off meant losing the job, and losing the job meant missing the mortgage payment on the house she had just bought on Barker Street. The knuckles on both hands were thick with calcium deposits, the skin permanently rough. When she shook your hand, you knew immediately that this was a person who had spent her life making things hold together. Henry Holloway had spent his life making people hold together, which was a different kind of construction, but no less demanding. He had taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School for 35 years, from 1966 to 2001. And in that time, he had learned approximately 4,000 children's names, bought school supplies with his own money when the budget ran out every March, and developed an ability to read a child's face the way a meteorologist reads a pressure map. He could tell when a student was lying about homework, hiding a bruise, pretending to understand long division, or quietly falling apart inside while maintaining a perfect exterior. This skill, honed over 3.5 decades of 8-year-olds, would prove to be the most important tool either of them carried into what came next. Henry was the one who stayed late. He tutored struggling readers during his lunch hour, coached the school spelling bee for 20 consecutive years, and once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to deliver a winter coat to a student whose family couldn't afford one. When he retired at 68, the school gave him a plaque and a sheet cake from the grocery store bakery. He put the plaque in a drawer and brought the cake to the neighbors on Barker Street. Because Henry Holloway did not believe that 35 years of showing up deserved a trophy. Showing up was the baseline. Everything else was just work. They married in 1972. The photograph from that day showed Maggie in her mother's dress, which was 2 inches too short and slightly yellowed at the collar, and Henry in a vest borrowed from his roommate, which was 1 size too large and made him look like a boy playing dress-up at a wedding he had wandered into by accident. They were both grinning in the photograph, with the uncomplicated certainty of two people who had not yet learned how many ways the world could go wrong, but who suspected correctly that facing it together improved the odds. They raised 3 children in a 4-room house on Barker Street. Maggie built the porch herself the summer before their first child was born, added a half bathroom when the kids were small enough to fight over the single toilet every morning, and replaced the roof every 12 years. Whether it needed it or not, because she believed in maintenance the way some people believed in prayer. Henry kept the kitchen warm, the homework supervised, and the inevitable sibling warfare limited to skirmishes rather than full campaigns. They were not rich. They were the kind of people who understood that a little managed carefully could be stretched into enough. Their eldest was David. He had been ambitious since the age of 15 when he announced at the dinner table that he was going to be the first person in the family to go to college, and then the first person in the family to make real money in that order. He said it with the confidence of a boy who had already decided that Barker Street was a place to live, not a place to become. Maggie and Henry paid for his education by refinancing the house. Henry picked up weekend tutoring jobs at the library. Maggie took every overtime shift the contractors' union offered, including a 6-month stretch of Saturday work that left her so tired she fell asleep at the dinner table on Sunday afternoons with her boots still on. David graduated, moved to a city 3 hours south, and went into real estate development. He did well. Corner office by 32. New car every 2 years. A house with a dining room he never ate in a guest bedroom. No guest had ever slept in, and a home office where he spent evenings reviewing property assessments with the focused intensity of a man who measured his life in square footage and closing dates. He called home on holidays mostly. He visited on occasions that required his physical presence, which he defined narrowly. The summer David graduated, he had stood in the driveway on Barker Street with his diploma in one hand and his car keys in the other. Maggie was on the porch, still in her work boots, sawdust in her hair, from a job she had left early to make the ceremony. David had looked at her and then at the house behind her. The house she had maintained and improved and held together for 22 years, and he had made a promise. He told her he was going to build her a house someday. A real house, he had said, as if the one she had built with her own hands was somehow preliminary. Better than this one, he had added. Maggie had smiled and told him to drive safe. She never mentioned the promise again. Neither did he. But she remembered it the way you remember the first time someone you love reveals that they don't quite see you clearly. Their middle child, Lisa, became an accountant. She was careful, quiet, and constitutionally incapable of confrontation. She married young and settled 2 towns over in a house with neutral carpeting and a kitchen calendar where every square was filled with obligations written in her precise handwriting. She called on Sundays. The calls lasted between 8 and 14 minutes and covered weather, the children's school activities, and whatever recipe she had tried that week. She never asked difficult questions because difficult questions led to difficult answers. And Lisa preferred her life the way she preferred her spreadsheets, balanced, predictable, and free of entries that required investigation. Their youngest, Ryan, went into technology, moved to the West Coast, and called less and less as the years accumulated between them. The distance was partly geographic and partly something else. Ryan had married at 26, and by 32 the marriage was collapsing in the slow grinding way that marriages collapse when two people discover they have been building separate lives under the same roof. He was ashamed of the failure, ashamed of asking for help, and ashamed of his shame, which created a recursive loop of silence that grew wider every month. He stopped calling, not because he didn't care, but because every time he picked up the phone, he would have to explain why he hadn't called last time, and the explanation would require admitting things he wasn't ready to admit. Maggie and Henry didn't complain about any of it. They had done what parents do. They had poured everything they had into 3 children, so those children could have more than they had had, and it had worked. Their children had more. More money, more space, more opportunity, more of every measurable thing. Just not more time for the 2 people who had made the investment possible. The first sign came when Maggie turned 74. Henry noticed she was slower on the stairs, gripping the banister in a way she never had before. She forgot where she had put her reading glasses, asked the same question twice at dinner, and once stood in the hardware store aisle for a full minute, staring at a box of screws as if she had forgotten what they were for. These were small things, individually meaningless, but Henry had spent decades noticing small things in children, and he knew that small things were how big things announced themselves. He didn't say anything to Maggie because Maggie was proud, and her pride was not the fragile, defensive kind that crumbles when challenged. It was the deep, structural kind, load-bearing the kind that had allowed her to walk onto all-male job sites for 4 decades and never once ask for accommodation. You didn't chip at that kind of pride. You worked around it. So Henry called David. He mentioned it casually the way you mention weather, when what you really want to talk about is the storm coming. He said Maggie seemed a little slower lately, a little forgetful. Nothing dramatic, just something to keep an eye on. David said he would look into options. He looked into options for 2 years. Then on a Saturday morning in early October, a black SUV pulled into the driveway on Barker Street. David hadn't visited in 8 months. He brought Lisa with him. Ryan didn't come. David explained that Ryan was tied up with a project, which was technically true in the way that a man drowning is technically tied up with water. They stood in the kitchen. Maggie was at the counter, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching her 2 oldest children with the quiet attention she gave to anything she was trying to assess structurally. David was wearing a sport coat, and the expression he used in client meetings, pleasant, professional, and sealed against any emotion that might complicate the transaction. He told them he had found a place for them. A nice facility, very clean, good reviews. They would be comfortable there. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent 15 years making uncomfortable things sound reasonable to people sitting across conference tables. Henry set down his coffee cup. The word landed in the kitchen like a drop tool. A facility. David kept going. It was temporary, he explained. Just until they figured out the house situation. Property taxes had gone up again, and with Maggie's medical costs, the numbers didn't work anymore. He said the numbers the way he said every number, as a fact that existed independent of the people it affected. Maggie spoke from the doorway where she had moved without either of them noticing, because 42 years of working job sites had taught her that you always want to know where the exits are. She asked what numbers he was talking about. The finances, David answered with just a trace of impatience. They had been over this, but they hadn't been over anything. David had never once sat down with his parents and opened a ledger or a spreadsheet or even a napkin with figures on it. He had conducted this entire assessment from his corner office 3 hours south, using the same methodology he used to evaluate distressed properties remotely, efficiently, and without emotional attachment to the structure. Henry looked at Lisa. She was standing behind David with her arms crossed and her eyes on the linoleum floor. He didn't need decades of reading children's faces to know what he was seeing. But he had them, and what he saw was clear. Lisa knew. She knew this wasn't temporary. She knew David hadn't researched facilities or made arrangements for their comfort or sorted out anything at all. She knew, and she had come anyway because David had told her to come. And Lisa had spent her entire life doing what was easier rather than what was right. Henry asked her directly. Lisa nodded. She didn't speak. Her eyes stayed on the floor, and Henry recognized the posture because he had seen it in hundreds of children over the years. It was the posture of someone who has done something wrong and knows it and is waiting for the adult to decide what happens next. Maggie's voice cut through the kitchen. She told them they weren't going to a facility. David asked her to be reasonable. Her response came flat and hard. She said she was being reasonable. This was their home. She had built half of it with her own hands. David rubbed his temples the way he did when a zoning board pushed back on a permit application. He repeated that it was temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month, just until things got sorted out. Henry watched his son's face. He saw it clearly, more clearly than Lisa's guilt or David's impatience. He saw that David wasn't sorting anything out. David was clearing a problem off his desk. He was applying the same logic he applied to underperforming properties in his portfolio. Identify the liability, relocate it. Move on to the next deal. Maggie and Henry weren't his parents in this calculation. They were a line item, but Maggie believed him. That was the part that would haunt Henry later in the motel, in the church, in the dark. Maggie, who could look at a wall and tell you in 3 seconds whether it was load-bearing, who could read a blueprint the way Henry read faces, who had never in her life been fooled by a bad joint or a crooked measurement, believed her son when he said a few weeks. Because Maggie had never broken a promise in her life, and she could not imagine that someone she had built from scratch, carried inside her body, fed with her own earnings, and taught to hold a hammer at the age of 8, would break one either. So she packed 2 suitcases. That was what 42 years of marriage and 42 years of carpentry and 35 years of teaching and a house on Barker Street and a porch built by hand and a roof replaced every 12 years came down to. 2 suitcases and whatever fit inside. Henry packed clothes, medication. Maggie's reading glasses, his Bible, and 1 photograph. Their wedding day, 1972. Maggie in her mother's dress, Henry in the borrowed vest. Both of them grinning like they already knew the answer to a question nobody had asked yet. He slipped the photograph into his wallet. Something in him, some instinct for preserving evidence, told him he might need proof that they had once been young and absolutely certain about the future. David drove them to the Pineview Motor Lodge. It sat off the highway behind a gas station with a neon sign missing 2 letters and a parking lot that looked like it had been shelled. The building was single-story beige stucco with doors that opened directly onto the lot and windows that hadn't been washed since the previous decade. David unloaded the suitcases onto the curb. He said he would call that week. He said temporary one more time, and the word had already started to lose its meaning. The way a key loses its teeth when you use it to pry open something it wasn't designed for. He drove away. The SUV turned onto the highway and merged into traffic and disappeared, and Henry stood on the curb holding both suitcases and watching the space where his son's car had been. Maggie stood beside him. Neither of them moved for a long time. The room cost $30 a night, cash only. It smelled like carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke layered over each other in a way that suggested decades of failed attempts to make the place presentable. The heater rattled but worked. The shower ran hot for exactly 4 minutes before turning cold with a shudder that traveled through the pipes and into the walls. The television was broken. The pillow smelled like someone else's hair. They made it stretch. Henry bought bread and peanut butter from the gas station across the road. Maggie fixed the dripping bathroom faucet on the second day, not because anyone asked, but because a dripping faucet was a problem she could solve. And at that moment, solvable problems felt like gifts. The motel manager was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and the cautious friendliness of someone who had learned to assess guests quickly and without sentiment. She noticed the faucet repair and asked if Maggie could look at a broken door hinge in room 12. Maggie fixed it in 10 minutes. The manager knocked 2 nights off their bill and didn't ask questions about why a 76-year-old woman with carpenter's hands was living in a highway motel with her husband and 2 suitcases. Henry tried David on the third day. Voicemail. He left a message brief, not pleading, just asking David to call back when he had a chance. He tried again on the 5th day. Voicemail again. He tried Ryan. The number had been disconnected, which Henry didn't know was because Ryan had changed carriers during the divorce and hadn't sent the new number to anyone yet. Because Ryan was in the particular kind of personal freefall where updating your family's contact list feels like an impossible task. Maggie sat on the edge of the motel bed staring at her hands. The hands that had framed houses and hung doors and replaced roofs. The hands that her son had held when he was learning to walk, the same son who had driven away without looking back. Her voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a woman stating a structural fact. They'll call back. David said he'd sort it out. Henry sat beside her and took her hand. He didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with hope, and hope was the last load-bearing wall in a structure that was coming down around them. You don't kick out the last wall. You brace it and pray. $220 at $30 a night, minus the 2 nights the manager had comped. Henry did the math on the back of a gas station receipt. He calculated that they had 5 days before the money disappeared completely. 5 days and then nothing. No cushion, no backup, no second option. Henry told Maggie they could try the church. Maggie's jaw tightened. She said she wasn't taking charity. Henry looked at her, this woman who had spent 42 years building things for other people and had never once asked anyone to build anything for her. He told her they were living in a motel room with a broken television and a pillow that smelled like someone else's hair. They were the charity. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something moved across her face that might have been the beginning of a smile if circumstances had been different. They went to the church. The pastor was kind in the way that small-town pastors learn to be kind, which is to say honestly without illusions about what kindness can and cannot fix. He could put them up for 2 nights in the fellowship hall. After that, the best he could offer was a list of shelters in the county. He said the word shelters carefully, the way you say a word when you know it is going to land on someone like a stone. Shelters. Maggie Holloway, who had built houses with her bare hands for 4 decades, who had framed walls and hung joists and laid floors in buildings that would stand for 100 years, was looking at a photocopied list of shelters. They spent those 2 nights on cots in the fellowship hall, surrounded by folding chairs and the faint smell of Sunday coffee that had seeped into the carpet and the walls and the fabric of the curtains over years of after-service socializing. Henry slept, or something close to it. Maggie didn't. She lay on the cot staring at the ceiling tiles, turning the same question over in her mind, like a carpenter turning a piece of wood, examining it from every angle, looking for the grain. How did we get here? Not as a question exactly, more as an engineering problem, a structural failure. Somewhere a load had shifted, a support had given way, and the whole thing had come down. She was trying to find the point of failure, the moment when the weight exceeded the capacity, and she kept arriving at the same answer. The failure point was trust. She had trusted her son the way she trusted a foundation, absolutely, because she had built him, and she knew what she had put into the construction. But foundations crack, even good ones, even ones built with everything you have. On the second morning, Henry walked to the county office building 2 blocks from the church. He had taught 3rd graders for 35 years, which meant he knew how to find information, who to ask for it, and how to frame a request, so that the person behind the desk felt helpful rather than imposed upon. These were skills that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with survival. He told the clerk at the property records desk that he and his wife needed a place to live and had almost no money. He said it plainly without embarrassment, because Henry had spent his career teaching children that asking for help is not the same as admitting weakness. And he practiced what he taught even when it cost him. The clerk was a young woman with glasses and the kind expression of someone who had not yet been in the job long enough to lose it. She typed something into her computer and frowned. There was a tax sale listing, she said, that had been sitting in the system for years. Nobody wanted it. An old county jail about 12 miles east of town of Hadley Road, abandoned since the mid-90s. Henry asked how much. $6. That was the minimum the county could accept at tax auction. Henry asked about the condition. The clerk hesitated, and her hesitation told him more than her answer. She said it was standing. That was about all she could confirm. Henry walked back to the fellowship hall and told Maggie what he had found. Her reaction came in a single word, repeated with the flat incredulity of someone who has just been told that the solution to their homelessness is incarceration. A jail. Henry didn't flinch. He called it a building, with walls and a roof. Maggie repeated that it was a jail. Henry reminded her that it was $6 and they had 11 left. She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Then she asked if they could see it. The pastor drove them out that afternoon in his 10-year-old sedan with a crack across the windshield and a back seat full of hymnals he kept meaning to drop off at the thrift store. 12 miles east, past cornfields that had been harvested down to stubble, past empty lots where buildings had once been, past a boarded-up feed store and a rusted grain elevator, until the paved road gave up and turned to gravel. The gravel went on for another mile, narrowing between overgrown ditches and leaning fence posts strung with wire that hadn't held anything in years until it ended at a clearing. The jail sat at the center of the clearing, like something the land was trying to pull back underground. 2 stories of gray limestone built in the style of small county jails from the 1930s, designed to be permanent in the way that punishment was supposed to be permanent. Barred windows on every side. A front entrance flanked by concrete pillars that had cracked and shifted over the decades, spreading apart like old teeth. The roof was intact but sagging in the middle, a shallow V that collected rainwater and sent it down the interior walls. Weeds grew through the front steps. A chain hung loose across the door, and the padlock at its center had rusted open, which seemed like either neglect or an invitation depending on how you chose to read it. Maggie got out of the car slowly. Her knees had been bad since the late 90s, and the cold air didn't help, but she stood and looked at the building, the way she looked at anything. Not as a person seeing a ruin, but as a carpenter seeing a skeleton. Her eyes moved from the foundation to the roofline to the window headers, to the corners where the walls met, reading the structure the way Henry read faces looking for the truth underneath the surface. The foundation was limestone, she said. Cut blocks properly laid with mortar joints that had cracked in places but hadn't shifted. That was why it was still standing. Whoever had built this thing in the 1930s had built it the way you build something when you expect it to outlast you. The walls were probably 18 inches thick. The window headers were solid stone. The whole structure was essentially a stone box with a roof on it, and stone boxes don't fall down. They just sit there waiting for someone to give them a reason to be useful again. She walked to the entrance. The door was heavy solid wood swollen with moisture, but still on its hinges. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The main corridor stretched ahead, dim and cold, with cells lining both sides. Iron bars from floor to ceiling sunk into the stone at the top and bolted to steel plates at the bottom. Concrete floors stained with decades of neglect. A processing desk sat near the entrance, its surface covered with dust and mouse droppings, and the grime that accumulates in places where no one has moved anything in 30 years. A bulletin board on the wall still held a faded notice from 1993, the text too bleached to read, held in place by a thumbtack that had rusted into the cork. Henry followed her in. He walked to the nearest cell and looked through the bars. The space inside was about 8 feet by 10, small. The walls were solid stone on 3 sides, the bars on the 4th. A narrow window high up barred, but with glass still intact. The ceiling was high, maybe 10 feet, which made the small room feel less like a box and more like a shaft. No leaks that he could see, no cracks in the stone. The floor was cold but level. He touched the bars, solid iron, not hollow, bolted into the stone with hardware that had gone orange with rust, but hadn't loosened. These bars weren't going anywhere. Nothing in this building was going anywhere. That was either the problem or the solution, and Henry was starting to think it might be both. He said something then, standing in the corridor of an abandoned jail, with his hand on a set of iron bars and his wife beside him, and their entire remaining wealth, amounting to $11 and 2 suitcases in the trunk of a pastor's car. He said they had raised 3 children in a 4-room house, and he thought they could manage a few jail cells. Maggie looked at him. 42 years of marriage, and he could still surprise her. She pulled out her wallet. The wallet was old leather, cracked and soft, and it contained $6 in singles, which he counted out and handed to the pastor. She asked if he would mind dropping them at the county office. The pastor looked at the money, then at the jail, then at Maggie. He asked if she was sure. Her answer came without hesitation, but it was honest in a way that mattered. No, she said she wasn't sure. But she was sure about him. She looked at Henry when she said it, and the pastor understood that he was witnessing something that didn't require his commentary. So he took the $6 and said he would file the paperwork that afternoon. They spent their first night on the concrete floor of the cell closest to the front entrance. Maggie wedged the outer door shut with a piece of wood she had pried from the processing desk frame. Henry folded his coat into a pillow and laid it on the floor beside hers. They had no electricity, no running water, no heat. The October air came through the broken windows on the second floor and traveled down the stairwell and settled into the corridor like something alive, something that had been living in this building for 30 years and was not particularly pleased about the company. Maggie lay beside Henry in the dark. She could hear the wind moving through the corridor, rattling loose things, making the building groan and shift in ways that were not structural but atmospheric. The sounds were the sounds of an empty building adjusting to the presence of people. Not welcoming exactly, not hostile, waiting. Henry's voice in the dark, just her name. She reached for his hand, found it, held it. She told him they were going to be all right. She said it the way she said everything as a structural assessment. A statement about the load-bearing capacity of 2 people who had nothing left except each other and a building made of stone. He said he knew, he didn't. But he said it because some things you say, not because they're true, but because they need to be true. And saying them out loud is the first step in the construction. Sometime deep in the night, Maggie woke to sounds she couldn't immediately identify. Fabric tearing, the scrape of metal against stone. She sat up and saw Henry's silhouette moving in the faint moonlight that came through the barred window of their cell. He had torn a strip from the lining of his suitcase, a piece of burgundy fabric about 2 feet wide, and he was tying it to the bars of the window. Stretching it across the opening, pulling it taut. Knotting it at both ends with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades tying shoes for children who hadn't learned yet. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at it. The fabric caught the moonlight and glowed faintly against the iron, a small rectangle of color in a room made entirely of gray. He said one word, "There." Then he added that now it was a window. Maggie watched him from the floor. This man who had given 35 years to other people's children and raised 3 of his own and been driven to a motel and then a church and then a jail and still had the will to hang a curtain. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She lay back down, took his hand again, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. Dawn came through those barred windows in pale stripes. The light fell across the concrete floor in a pattern of bars and gaps, shadow and brightness repeating itself down the length of the corridor. To most people, it would have looked like a cage. Maggie saw something else. She saw geometry. She saw parallel lines and right angles and the mathematical regularity of a structure built by people who understood that precision is what keeps things standing. She saw a building that had survived 60 years of weather and neglect and abandonment, Because some crew of Depression-era masons and iron workers had put it together right. She stood slowly. Her knees protested the concrete floor, and her back had stiffened during the night into a single rigid plank of pain that ran from her shoulders to her hips. She stretched, felt things pop and grind, and walked the length of the corridor. 12 cells, 6 on each side. Each one approximately 8 by 10 feet with iron bars on the front and solid stone on the remaining 3 walls. High ceilings, a narrow window in each cell barred but intact. Beyond the cell block, the processing area near the front entrance with the desk and the bulletin board and a bench bolted to the wall. A larger room in the back that might have been a common area or a mess hall with a concrete floor and high windows and a drain in the center. A set of stairs leading to a second floor with 6 more cells and what looked like an administrative office with a door that's still closed. The roof was mostly sound. 2 spots near the center where water had gotten in over the years, staining the ceiling and the walls below it. But the damage was contained to surface deterioration. The plumbing was old iron pipes that had been shut off at the main valve somewhere outside the building decades ago, but Maggie could see where the connections ran. The electrical panel was ancient and dead, a flat gray box with a door that hung open on one hinge, revealing a row of breakers that hadn't moved since 1994. But the conduit was still in the walls, which meant the pathways were there, even if the current wasn't. She came back to their cell and found Henry sitting up folding his coat. She told him the bones were good. She could work with this. She said she was going to need tools. Henry reached into his wallet and pulled out the $5 they had left. He held it out. $5. For tools, for supplies, for materials, for everything they would need to turn a condemned jail into something a human being could survive inside. Maggie looked at the money. She said it wouldn't buy a hammer. Henry's answer came back immediately. Then they'd have to get creative. She took the money and walked out into the gray October morning where the gravel road stretched away toward a town she barely knew and a future she couldn't see. And she started figuring out how to build a life from nothing, which was when she thought about it. Exactly what she had been doing since she was 17 years old. The difference was that this time, the stakes were her own. Maggie found the storage closet on her second pass through the building, tucked behind the mess hall, in a space that had been used for maintenance supplies when the jail was operational. The door was swollen shut, and she had to put her shoulder into it, which sent a bolt of pain down her left side that she ignored the way she had been ignoring pain for 40 years by continuing to move. Inside, a rusted toolbox sat on a metal shelf beside a coffee can full of assorted nails and a roll of electrical tape that had fused into a solid black disc. She opened the toolbox, a claw hammer with a loose head, a handsaw with a dull blade, a pry bar, and a level green liquid in a glass tube set into aluminum that she held up to the light and watched the bubbles settle dead center, still true after 30 years in a closet. She gripped it like a lifeline. The interior corridor had a dividing wall between the processing area and the cell block, and running along it were 18 iron bars set into the stone at regular intervals, decorative, rather than structural remnants of some county official's idea of what a jail should look like from the inside. Each bar was solid steel about 4 feet long and an inch thick. Maggie tested one with the pry bar. Felt it resist, then felt it give. The mortar around the base had deteriorated enough that sustained effort could work each bar free without damaging the stone. She started on a Monday morning and finished on Tuesday evening. Her shoulders burning and her crooked finger throbbing with every leverage point, and she stacked all 18 bars in the wheelbarrow. She had found behind the building a flat tire rack that still rolled if you kept your weight centered. She pushed it to the road and waited. A pickup truck appeared after 20 minutes. A farmer heading toward town with an empty bed and the unhurried expression of someone whose schedule was determined by seasons rather than clocks. Maggie waved him down and asked if the scrapyard on Route 9 was still operating. It was. She asked for a ride. The farmer looked at the 76-year-old woman standing on a gravel road with a wheelbarrow full of iron bars, and whatever questions he had, he kept them to himself. The scrapyard paid $62. Maggie folded the bills into her pocket and walked to the hardware store on the town's main street, a place called Hobbs Hardware that had occupied the same corner for 4 decades and looked like it had been built from the leftover inventory of every era it had survived. The woman behind the counter was about Maggie's age, maybe a year or two older, with thick forearms and a face that carried the particular weathering of someone who had spent a lifetime hauling stock and cutting keys and mixing paint for people who couldn't decide between eggshell and sateen. Her name, according to the stitched patch on her canvas apron, was June. Maggie told her she needed supplies. She had $67 and a significant amount of work ahead of her. June asked what kind of work. Maggie explained that she had purchased the old county jail off Hadley Road and that she and her husband were converting it into a livable space. June set down the invoice she had been reviewing and looked at Maggie with the careful attention of someone recalibrating her assumptions in real time. June came around the counter. She looked at Maggie's hands the way one tradesperson reads another, not with curiosity but with recognition. She asked how long Maggie had been in the trade. 42 years, Maggie told her. June extended her hand. Her grip matched Maggie's. She walked Maggie through the store, pulling items from shelves with the efficiency of someone who knew where everything was without checking. Lumber scraps from cut orders that customers had rejected or never picked up. A box of mismatched screws, a partial roll of Romex wire, 2 copper pipe fittings that had been pulled for a plumbing order and returned because they were the wrong specification. At the register, June entered numbers and announced the total, $67 even. The lumber scraps alone were worth more than that. Maggie knew it. June knew Maggie knew it. The transaction existed in a space between commerce and something else, something that didn't have a name, but that both women understood because they had each spent decades in trades, where you learn to recognize the difference between a person who needed a deal and a person who needed a hand up, and you responded accordingly without making a performance of it. Maggie told June she would pay back the difference. June's response was immediate and final. She said there was no difference, that those were clearance items, and her tone made it clear that the subject was closed with the permanence of a mortise joint. Maggie carried the supplies back to the jail on foot. 3 miles on gravel uphill for the last stretch with a bad knee and $67 worth of materials balanced across her arms and shoulders. It took 2 hours. She stopped twice. Both times she stood on the side of the road with the weight pulling at her spine and the afternoon light stretching her shadow out behind her. And both times she looked at what she was carrying and kept going. Henry had been working while she was gone. He had swept the entire first-floor corridor with a broom he assembled from a branch and dried grass bound with string. He had scrubbed the processing desk until the original wood grain emerged from beneath decades of grime. Every piece of debris, every dead mouse, every shard of glass had been collected and stacked outside the entrance. And he had found the well, a hand pump behind the building set into a concrete pad that was cracked but stable. The mechanism had ceased from disuse, and Henry had spent most of the afternoon working it loose with penetrating oil from the maintenance closet. And the stubbornness of a man who had once spent 3 hours helping a third grader understand the concept of carrying in addition and refused to quit until the child got it. The water ran brown for the first several minutes, then cleared. He had tasted it, cold with a mineral edge, but clean. They had water. They had tools. They had $67 of supplies. Maggie started on the first cell that evening, working until the October light faded to a gray that made measurement impossible. She stripped the bars from the cell front, keeping the stone frame intact. She fitted a piece of salvaged lumber across the opening as a header, then used the remaining bars to fabricate a rough door frame, which she hung on hinges she had pulled from the storage closet. The door was crude, a plank assembly with gaps you could see through, but it swung and it latched, and the latch was on the inside, which was a detail Maggie installed without thinking about it consciously, but which carried the entire philosophical weight of what they were building. She built a bed frame from the lumber scraps. No mattress yet, so she laid boards across the top and covered them with their coats. Henry washed the walls with well water, and a rag torn from a shirt neither of them would miss. He hung another strip of suitcase lining across the window. He placed their wedding photograph on a small shelf Maggie had nailed to the stone. They stood in the doorway and looked at it. A room. Cold plain, small enough that you could touch opposite walls without fully extending your arms. But a room with a door that closed and a shelf with a photograph and a window with a curtain. Henry's voice was quiet. He called it theirs and said that made it plenty. The town found out the way towns find out everything. Through the slow accumulation of small conversations that build into common knowledge the way sediment builds into stone. The pastor mentioned it during a sermon. June told a handful of customers she had selected for their decency rather than their curiosity. The woman who owned the diner on the county road heard about it third hand and drove out one afternoon in a station wagon loaded with blankets and canned goods. She stood at the entrance and called inside, and Henry came to the door. The woman held up the box and said she had heard about them and wanted to help. Henry thanked her and asked if she would like to come in and see what they were doing. She came in. She walked the corridor. She looked at the converted cell and the bare ones waiting. When she left, she told 3 people. Those 3 told others. A farmer left a bag of potatoes and a dozen eggs on the front step without knocking. A retired electrician named Cal drove out, examined the wiring, and returned the next day with cable and junction boxes. Cal had been an electrician for 38 years and retired 2 years ago, and had been waiting since then for someone to give him a reason to pick up his tools again. He spent 2 days wiring the first floor, running a line from a utility pole at the edge of the property. The pole served a dairy farm a quarter-mile north, and the line to the jail property had never been physically disconnected, only administratively suspended when the county stopped paying the account. Cal called the power company, explained the situation, and got the account transferred to the property's new owner for a minimum monthly charge that Maggie would cover by repairing furniture in town. The first time Henry flipped a light switch and the bulb came on, he stood in the corridor with his palm pressed flat against his chest as if holding something in place. He called for Maggie. She came from the cell she was working on, saw the light, and laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that arrives without permission and leaves before you can examine it. Henry hadn't heard that sound from her in months. Maggie converted the processing room into a kitchen. She built a counter from lumber, installed a donated sink, connected it to the well pump with the copper fittings from June's store. A woman from the church brought a propane camp stove. Another family donated a refrigerator that hummed and rattled and made a noise like a small distressed animal when its compressor kicked on, but it kept things cold and cold. Things stayed edible and edible things kept people alive. Henry claimed the dirt yard behind the building. It was enclosed by a low stone wall open to the sky and had been used as an exercise area when the jail was operational. He cleared it of weeds and broken concrete, turned the soil with a sharpened shovel, and planted seeds from packets that cost 89 cents each at the dollar store in town. Beans, tomatoes, squash, herbs. He planted them in rows as neat and precise as the lesson plans he used to write, because Henry believed that order was the first step toward growth, whether you were growing vegetables or children. By the end of the first month, they had a bedroom, a functioning kitchen, running water, electricity on the first floor, and a garden. Maggie had converted 4 additional cells into rooms, even though it was just the 2 of them. When Henry asked why, she shrugged and said she might as well do them all while she was at it. He noticed that each room was slightly different. One had wider shelves, one had a lower bed frame, one had hooks on the wall at a height that would accommodate someone shorter. She was building for people who hadn't arrived yet. It was a Tuesday evening in early December, about 6 weeks after they had moved in, when they heard footsteps on the gravel, slow, uneven, hesitant. Henry was heating soup in the kitchen. He wiped his hands and went to the entrance. A young man stood on the steps, mid-20s, thin, wearing a jacket inadequate for the temperature. A backpack hung from one shoulder. His other arm held a boy maybe 2 years old asleep against his chest, with a knitted cap pulled down over his ears. The boy's face was flushed with the deep, trusting sleep of a child who has decided that his father's arms are safe regardless of what is happening beyond them. But it was the bruise that Henry saw first, a dark mark along the young man's jaw shading from purple at the center to yellow at the edges. About a week old, Henry estimated. The young man's voice was steady, but his eyes moved constantly, scanning the space behind Henry, checking exits, measuring distance. He apologized for the intrusion. His car had broken down about a mile back on the road. He had seen the light and hadn't known where else to go. He needed a phone if they had one. Henry opened the door wider. He told him to come inside, that it was cold, and that he had soup and a phone. The young man looked past Henry into the corridor at the stone walls and the converted cells, and the warm light from the kitchen. He asked if this was a jail. Henry told him it used to be, that now it was a home, and asked him to sit down. His name was Eli. He didn't offer a last name, and Henry didn't request one. He ate 2 bowls of soup one-handed while the boy slept against his shoulder, and Henry talked about the garden and Maggie's carpentry, and the refrigerator's vocal habits, filling the silence with the safe, ordinary details that allow a frightened person to lower their guard without being asked to explain their fear. Maggie came in from the second floor, where she had been measuring windows. She looked at Eli, looked at the sleeping child, looked at Henry, and went to get another bowl. She asked where he was headed. Eli's answer was a single word: anywhere. He had left in a hurry. He had had a plan, but the car had vetoed it. Henry asked gently if he had family somewhere. Eli shook his head. "Not the kind you can go back to," he said. And the sentence carried the specific weight of someone who has learned that home can be the most dangerous place in the world. Henry told him they had an extra room if he needed a place for the night. Eli's protest was immediate. He didn't have money. Henry's response arrived without pause. He asked if anyone had mentioned money. Eli looked at him, then at Maggie, then at the kitchen with its warm light and its donated stove and its rattling refrigerator, and the bowl of soup sitting in front of him, like evidence of something he had stopped believing existed. He asked why they were being kind to him. He said they didn't know him. Henry reached across the table and put his hand briefly on Eli's forearm, a gesture calibrated by decades of experience with children who flinch. "Because someone should be," he said. And the words landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Eli stayed that night. He was still there the next morning. Maggie walked into the cell next to theirs, measured the space, and built a bed frame with a lower profile so Eli could get Leo in and out without bending at an awkward angle. She built a small crib from pine scraps, sanded every surface twice, and set it against the wall where the morning light from the window would fall across it without hitting the child's eyes directly. A week later, Ruth arrived. 81 years old, a widow whose husband's medical bills had consumed the house and the savings and the car and everything else that 40 years of marriage had accumulated. She had been sleeping in her remaining vehicle, a sedan with a heater that worked intermittently, parked in the church lot for 3 months. June had told her about the jail. Ruth stood in the corridor with her hat in her hands, and the particular dignity of an elderly woman who's about to ask for help and is determined to do it without losing her composure. She asked Maggie if there was room. Maggie looked down the row of converted cells. 8 rooms, each one finished and waiting. She told Ruth to pick whichever one she liked. Ruth chose the one closest to the kitchen because she was 81 and practical and wanted to be near the food. Then Tessa, 17. Her family had made it clear that she was no longer welcome, and the reasons were the kind that Tessa didn't discuss and Henry didn't ask about, because he had been a teacher long enough to know that the details of a child's expulsion from home matter less than the fact of it. She had been sleeping on couches for 2 months until the last couch disappeared a week ago. She heard about the jail from a girl at the public library who had heard about it from someone at the church. Tessa stood at the end of the gravel road for nearly an hour before approaching. Henry went out to her. She asked if it was true that they took people in. Henry told her they had rooms and if she needed one, there was a bed. She said she didn't have money. He told her nobody there did. He showed her a room on the 2nd floor. She set her duffel bag on the bed and stood there looking at the stone walls. She said it had been a jail cell. Henry confirmed it. Her response came quietly, directed more at the room than at him. She said it felt safer than most places she had slept. Henry went downstairs and found Maggie at the kitchen table, sketching on a piece of cardboard with a carpenter's pencil. He asked what she was drawing. A table, she told him, a bigger one. The current one seated 4. They needed one that seated 8. Henry looked at her. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that didn't require language. She set down her pencil and told him she thought they had stopped asking whether more people were coming about 2 weeks ago. She built the new table over 3 days. 8 feet long, assembled from lumber scraps and salvage planks, sanded smooth by hand, sealed with linseed oil from a dented can June had donated. It was the finest piece of furniture Maggie had built in years, constructed from materials that other people had discarded, in a building that the county had given up on for people that the world had decided didn't matter. The first evening, all of them sat together at the new table, 7 people in a converted jail, eating bean soup and cornbread that Henry had taught Eli to make. Ruth told a story about a fish her husband had caught 40 years ago that grew larger with every telling. Tessa laughed, and the sound surprised her enough that she covered her mouth. Eli asked for seconds with Leo balanced on his knee. Henry refilled bowls. Maggie sat at the head of the table and watched. This was the moment it became something. Not just a shelter, not just a building, a household. 3 days later, the letter arrived from the County Code Enforcement Office. Maggie opened it at the kitchen table. Structural assessment, electrical inspection, plumbing. Evaluation occupancy standards. Fire safety compliance. 30 days. If the building failed, they would issue a condemnation order. Everything they had built would be taken. Maggie read it twice and set it down. Henry picked it up, read it, folded it, and laid it flat on the table between them. His voice was steady when he spoke, the voice that communicates urgency without panic. He said they had 30 days and suggested they get to work. Maggie walked the building the next morning before sunrise with the county letter folded in her back pocket. She looked at everything through an inspector's eyes instead of her own, which meant looking for deficiency rather than potential. And the list was long. She wrote it on the back of a grocery bag. 23 items. The wiring Cal had done was solid but only covered the first floor. The plumbing worked for the kitchen and 1 bathroom near the entrance, but the upstairs pipes were dead. The staircase had 2 cracked treads. 3 windows on the second floor had no glass. The front entrance had no handrail. There was no fire escape from the second story, no smoke detectors, no fire extinguisher. She showed the list to June that afternoon. June read it, folded the paper, and put it in her apron pocket. She said she would make some calls. 2 days later, 3 trucks arrived on the gravel road. June in the first, Cal in the second. A woman Maggie hadn't met climbed out of the third, a plumber named Rena, who had retired the previous year and had spent 12 months discovering that retirement without purpose is just waiting. June told her there was someone who needed a hand. Rena said, pulling a toolbox from her truck bed. Maggie told her she needed about 12 hands. Rena counted the people standing in front of her and said she had 6. They would make it work. They drove through the weekend. Cal ran wire to the second floor and installed junction boxes that met code. Rena replaced the worst pipe sections and got water running to the upstairs bathroom. Maggie rebuilt the cracked stair treads, reinforced the railing, and patched the 2 spots on the roof where water had been entering. Eli held flashlights and passed tools with the focused attention of someone learning by watching. Ruth made coffee on the camp stove and delivered it to whoever was working. Tessa installed weather stripping on every door with a methodical patience that surprised everyone, including herself. Henry tracked progress the way he used to track curriculum benchmarks. On Saturday night, Tessa played music on her phone in the corridor while she worked, and the sound carried through the stone walls into Eli's room, where Leo had just fallen asleep. Eli came out fast, his voice sharp, his body wound tight with the tension of someone whose nervous system has been recalibrated by violence to treat unexpected noise as a threat. He told Tessa to turn it off. The words came out harder than he intended, carrying the freight of something that had nothing to do with music, and everything to do with the last apartment he had lived in, where unexpected sounds preceded events he was still learning to stop bracing for. Tessa's face closed like a door. She turned the music off, went upstairs, and didn't come down for the rest of the evening. The next morning, she found Henry in the kitchen and told him she didn't belong here. Her voice had the flat, preemptive quality of someone announcing a conclusion they have reached before anyone can reach it for them. Henry poured her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't tell her Eli hadn't meant it. He didn't offer comfort because comfort wasn't what she needed. She needed the truth delivered directly, without decoration, and with respect for her ability to handle it. He told her she had every right to be angry. He told her Eli had every right to be angry too. Then he asked her the only question that mattered, whether both of them wanted to be here enough to get past the anger. He didn't answer it for her. He let it sit on the table between them next to the coffee cups, and he waited. Because the most important thing a teacher can do is ask the right question and then get out of the way. That afternoon, Tessa went to Eli's room and installed weather stripping around his doorframe without saying a word. The rubber seal would block noise from the corridor. Eli watched her work. When she finished, he nodded. She nodded back. Neither of them spoke. The apology existed entirely in the act, which was fitting, because in a household built by a carpenter, meaning lived in what you constructed rather than what you said. By Sunday evening, 11 items were crossed off Maggie's list. 12 remained. She sat on the front steps with her hands aching and her back radiating a low, persistent heat that she knew was inflammation, but chose to classify as progress. June sat beside her. The window glass was the critical issue, June said. Open windows in a building where people slept would be the first thing an inspector flagged. Glass was expensive. June said she knew someone in the window replacement business who accumulated seconds and offcuts that couldn't be sold to retail customers. She would see what was available. Maggie looked at her, this woman she had known for less than 2 months, who had quietly subsidized their survival without ever calling it what it was. She asked June why she was doing all of this. She said June didn't owe them anything. June was quiet for a moment. She told Maggie she had spent 30 months in a jungle in 1968, and that when she came home, nobody had been particularly interested in helping her either. It took a long time, she said, to figure out that she couldn't do it alone. She stood up and brushed off her pants. Then she looked at Maggie and repeated something Maggie had said to her 2 weeks earlier offhand while they were sorting lumber at the store. A good carpenter doesn't tear down what's broken. She figures out what it's supposed to be. Maggie asked if June had remembered that. June told her she remembered everything useful. She said she would see Maggie Tuesday and walk to her truck. The glass arrived Thursday. Not seconds, not offcuts. New paints cut to specification delivered by a man in a van who said June had handled the payment and that the matter was not open for discussion. Maggie installed them over 3 days, sealing each one, checking for drafts, running her hand along every edge. The building changed with the windows in. It held warmth. The corridor went quiet. The rooms sealed around their occupants. Maggie noticed that Ruth slept later in the mornings. Eli stopped wrapping Leo in a double layer of blankets at night. Tessa left her door open during the day, which was a small thing that meant a large thing, because an open door in a building full of strangers is an act of trust. And trust was the material they were all learning to work with. On the night before the inspection, 7 people sat at the long table. Henry had made chicken stew from a donated bird and vegetables from the garden. The meal was plain but warm, and the kitchen smelled like bread because Eli had baked a loaf that afternoon using a recipe Henry had taught him. Ruth passed the bread. Tessa poured water. Eli cut Leo's food into small pieces with the concentration of a man still learning the specifics of fatherhood while practicing them in real time. Maggie sat at the head of the table. She caught Henry's eye across the 8 feet of salvaged lumber. He gave her a small nod, the same nod he had given her on their wedding day, and on the night he had hung a curtain on the bars of a cell and called it a window. It meant they were ready whatever arrived with the morning. At 9:15 the next day, a white sedan appeared at the far end of the gravel road trailing dust. Maggie stood on the front steps and watched it come. Henry stood beside her. Eli and Ruth and Tessa gathered behind them in the doorway, arranged not by plan but by instinct, the way a family arranges itself when something important is approaching. The inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked up the steps. Maggie shook his hand and introduced herself and her husband. She welcomed him to their home. He asked to go inside. Maggie held the door. He stopped 3 steps into the corridor. His clipboard dropped to his side. His pen hovered over the form without touching it. The corridor was clean and lit. The walls had been painted a soft cream that Eli's careful brush had applied over 3 weekends. The concrete floor was patched and covered with donated rugs. Overhead, functional light fixtures met code. And the cells, every one of them transformed. Iron bars replaced by wooden door frames. Solid doors that latched from the inside. Through the open doorways, beds with clean blankets, shelves with personal items, curtains in the windows. He walked the building for 45 minutes, checked every outlet, every faucet, every window latch, tested the staircase railing, stepped onto the fire escape Maggie had welded, and bounced on the treads. He crouched and examined the welds where metal met stone. He stood up and wrote something on his clipboard. When they returned to the entrance, he flipped through his notes. He told them he had driven out expecting to sign a condemnation. He had reviewed the county records. The property had been listed as uninhabitable since 1997. Maggie told him it had been uninhabitable. They fixed it. He looked at his notes again. The electrical work met code. The plumbing passed. The structural integrity was sound. The fire escape, he told her, was better than what he encountered in most commercial buildings. 3 items remained. A ventilation fan in the second-floor bathroom, a handrail on the front exterior steps, a carbon monoxide detector near the wood stove. Maggie told him all 3 would be done within the week. He filed the report as conditionally compliant. 30 days for the remaining items, then a follow-up inspection. Before he reached his car, he turned back. He asked Maggie about the doors, whether they all latched from the inside. She confirmed it. His observation was almost offhand. He noted that in a jail, doors lock from the outside. Maggie's response came without hesitation. This isn't a jail anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he agreed. He drove away, and Maggie stood on the steps until the dust settled and the gravel road was empty. And the only sound was the wind moving through the garden where Henry's winter greens were pushing through the cold frames growing toward a spring that neither of them had been sure they would live to see. Henry came out and put his hand on her shoulder. 2 words spoken quietly. They passed. She put her hand over his. They stood there without saying anything else. Behind them, Ruth appeared in the doorway and asked if everything was all right. Eli leaned against the corridor wall with Leo on his hip. Tessa stood with her arms crossed and her chin raised, the same posture she had held the day she arrived. Except now it looked less like defiance and more like something she had earned. Henry told them everything was fine. They were staying. The ventilation fan, the handrail, and the carbon monoxide detector were installed by Friday. June provided the materials. Maggie did the work. When the inspector returned 2 weeks later for the follow-up, he spent 10 minutes inside, checked the 3 items, signed off on the paperwork, and told Maggie to take care of herself. But a reporter named Sam had been at the county courthouse when the inspection results were filed. Sam covered municipal affairs for the county paper, which meant attending zoning board meetings and writing about property tax adjustments, and occasionally producing a human interest piece when the news cycle was slow enough to allow for actual humans. The filing caught Sam's attention because the address was unusual and the classification unprecedented. A former county jail occupied conditionally compliant residential use. Sam drove to Hadley Road on a Wednesday afternoon with a camera and a notebook. Henry answered the door. He invited Sam in, offered coffee, and walked the reporter through the building with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had spent decades giving tours of his classroom to parents on open school night. Maggie answered questions about the structural work with the precision of someone accustomed to explaining load calculations to building inspectors. Eli nodded hello and returned to the kitchen where he was teaching Leo to eat applesauce with a spoon, a project that required more patience than most construction jobs Maggie had ever undertaken. Ruth showed Sam the garden, describing each row of winter greens with proprietary pride. Tessa stayed in her room until Henry went upstairs and told her that the reporter was writing a story whether Tessa participated or not, and that her version of events belonged in it. She came down. Sam stayed for 3 hours. The photographs captured the corridor, the kitchen, the workshop, the garden, the rooms. Sam sat at the long table and wrote notes while Henry told the story from the beginning, starting with the 2 suitcases on the motel curb and ending with the inspector's signed report. He told it plainly without embellishment, because Henry had spent his career teaching children that the truth doesn't need decoration, it needs clarity. The article ran the following Sunday on the front page under a headline that described an elderly couple abandoned by their children who had turned a jail into a home for the forgotten. The paper had a website. The article was shared, then shared again, then picked up by a regional outlet that reformatted it with a more dramatic headline. And from there, it entered the current of national media, where stories about elderly people and abandoned buildings and unlikely acts of resilience travel fast, because they offer something that the news cycle rarely provides, which is the possibility that things can be repaired. Within a week, 3 television stations had called. A national morning show sent an inquiry. A wire service journalist drove 4 hours for an interview. Maggie handled the first 2 conversations and then informed Henry that she was finished talking. She had work to do. Henry managed the remaining press with the calm, structured communication of a man who had once explained fractions to a roomful of 8-year-olds for 6 consecutive hours without raising his voice. The coverage changed things. Donations arrived in volumes that shifted the project from survival to sustainability. Checks from strangers in other states. Gift cards. A lumber company in the next county donated a full load of materials delivered on a flatbed truck that barely fit down the gravel road. A plumbing supply house sent fixtures still in their factory packaging. A retired architect who had seen the story on television called and offered to draw renovation plans free of charge. Maggie accepted the materials. She was hesitant about the money. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, holding a check for $500 from a woman in Ohio who had written a note on the memo line that read, "For Maggie's hands." She told Henry they hadn't asked for this. Henry reminded her they hadn't asked for any of it. Not the blankets, not the eggs, not the $67 clearance receipt from June. They had done the work and people had responded. The scale had changed. The principle hadn't. The donations allowed Maggie to finish the second floor properly. Insulation between the stone walls and the new drywall. Lighting that met commercial code. Each room fitted with a window that opened and closed on hardware that worked, a bed with an actual mattress, a small closet, and a door with a deadbolt that turned from the inside. She installed a second bathroom upstairs with hot water from a donated water heater that she connected to the well pump through a system of copper pipes that Cal helped her solder over a weekend. 14 rooms, 14 doors, all opening inward. By February, 10 of the rooms were occupied. The new residents arrived without pattern or announcement, each carrying their own version of the same fundamental story, which was that the world had run out of room for them, and they had kept walking until they found a door that was open. A woman in her 60s whose landlord had sold her building and who arrived carrying a nursing bag because she had been a medical professional for 30 years, and her skills were the one thing the eviction couldn't take. A young couple whose combined misfortunes included a layoff, a car that died, and a landlord who changed the locks while they were at a job interview. A veteran in his 40s who said very little and showed up at Maggie's workshop every morning at 7 without being asked, sanding and staining and assembling, with the quiet competence of someone who had been trained to work in units and found solitary civilian life disorienting. Henry kept things organized. He posted a schedule in the kitchen. Meal duties rotated. Cleaning assignments were distributed equitably. The former nurse checked everyone's blood pressure weekly and reminded Ruth to take her heart medication. The construction worker patched things Maggie couldn't get to because she was busy with larger projects. The veteran became Maggie's unofficial apprentice, and she taught him joinery by demonstration rather than explanation, letting the wood and the tools do the talking. It worked. Not perfectly. There were arguments about bathroom priority during morning hours and a diplomatic incident over radio volume that Henry mediated by suggesting alternating stations on odd and even days. Eli had a night where something in his sleep brought back something from before, and he woke the corridor with a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a word. And Leo cried, and Ruth got up and made warm milk for the boy and sat with Eli until his breathing slowed. Nobody discussed it in the morning. The acknowledgement lived in the way Ruth poured Eli's coffee first at breakfast, and the way Eli carried Ruth's garden basket for her that afternoon. The economy of care that develops between people who have agreed to witness each other's damage without requiring an explanation. Henry's garden produced more than 7 people could eat. The winter greens had flourished under the cold frames, and by late January there were surplus baskets of kale and turnips and early lettuce. Ruth noticed first. She told Henry they had extra. Henry looked at the basket and decided to share it. Ruth drove the surplus into town in June's truck and left bags on doorsteps. The food bank at the church received a donation. The diner got a bag of herbs. The people who had been feeding Maggie and Henry were now being fed by them, and Henry understood why that mattered, because he had spent his career watching children learn the difference between receiving help and being part of something. One makes you grateful, the other makes you whole. Henry started a reading group. He found a box of donated paperbacks in June's truck bed one afternoon, westerns and mysteries and a few romance novels with cracked spines. He set them on a shelf in the old booking area near the entrance and mentioned to Tessa that she was welcome to borrow anything. Tessa read 3 books in her first week. She hadn't read anything longer than a text message since dropping out of school 2 years earlier. She came to Henry with questions about words she didn't know, and he answered them with the focused patience of a man who had been waiting 5 years for someone to need this from him again. And before either of them fully registered what was happening, they were having daily lessons at the kitchen table, while Ruth peeled potatoes and Eli folded laundry with Leo, stacking blocks on the floor beside him. In the evenings, they gathered in the common room Maggie had built from the old mess hall. She had installed a wood-burning stove donated by a farmer who had upgraded to propane. The stove heated the space enough that people could sit together without coats, which constituted luxury under the circumstances. Ruth told stories about the county's history. Eli knitted. He had learned from his grandmother as a child and hadn't touched yarn in years. But Henry found a bag at a thrift store and brought it home, and Eli picked up the needles again with the muscle memory of someone resuming a conversation interrupted mid-sentence. Tessa read in the corner. Sometimes she would look up from her book and watch the others, and Henry would catch on her face the look of someone realizing with surprise and without quite believing it that they are in a place where they are allowed to stay. In early March, Leo took his first full steps without holding on to anything. He had been pulling himself up on furniture for weeks, cruising along the edges of tables and chairs, with the determined concentration of a toddler who has decided that walking is a problem he intends to solve. On a Tuesday morning, he let go of the kitchen bench, took 4 unsteady steps toward Eli, and fell into his father's arms. Eli caught him and held him, and didn't let go for a long time. Ruth, who had been washing dishes at the sink, turned around and pressed her hand to her mouth. Henry, sitting at the table with Tessa's math homework spread in front of them, looked up and watched a man's face change in real time, watched the fear and the guardedness that Eli carried, like structural weight shift, just enough to let something else through. Maggie was in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She just watched the boy stand up in a room where people had once been locked in cages and take his first free steps across the floor. On a Saturday afternoon in late February, the sound of an engine reached the building from the gravel road. Maggie was in the workshop. The engine was rung for this place too smooth, too quiet, the sound of money rather than labor. She walked to the entrance and saw the black SUV parked on the gravel. David stood beside it in a suit jacket and dress shoes, looking at the building the way a person looks at an equation they can't solve. Henry came out of the kitchen and stopped in the corridor. Maggie stood at the entrance. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Henry walked forward and stood beside his wife. He greeted David by name. David greeted both of them. His shoes were already covered in dust from the gravel. He said he had seen the news coverage. He had driven down that morning. Henry noted it was the first time David had made it in nearly 5 months. They sat at the long table. Henry made coffee from habit rather than hospitality. David looked around the kitchen with eyes that moved quickly, assessing, calculating, the same eyes he used to evaluate distressed properties for acquisition. Except this property was not distressed. David launched into the language he knew best. He said this wasn't sustainable. He cited the lack of licensing, insurance, professional oversight. He described liability scenarios with the fluency of a man who had spent his career identifying risk in structures. One injury, he told them, and they would be exposed to litigation that would take everything. Maggie's voice was flat. She said they had been here 5 months and nobody had been injured. David countered that this was luck, not a plan. Henry cut in, his voice carrying the measured weight of a teacher correcting a student who is confident and wrong. He told David they had a plan. They took care of people. People took care of them. David leaned forward. That's not a plan, he told them. That's a nice idea. In the real world, nice ideas get you sued. Henry's hands were flat on the table, palms down. His response came evenly, and it landed hard. He told David that in the real world, people get dropped at motels by their children and never hear from them again. David went still. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's mechanical wheezing and Leo babbling in the next room and the distant sound of the veteran sanding something in the workshop below. Henry continued. He told David that David had left them 2 suitcases and a promise that was never meant to be kept. They had called. They had waited. They had sat in a motel watching their money disappear, and David never answered the phone. Then Henry told David what they had built. With $6 and these hands, he put his palm flat on the surface of the table Maggie had constructed from salvaged wood. He told David he didn't get to come in here and say it wasn't enough. David looked at the table, at his father's hand, at his mother sitting across from him, silent and steady. He started to explain the Henderson project, the delayed permits, how things had gotten away from him. Henry interrupted. He told David to say it correctly. They had gotten away from him, not things, them. David pressed his lips together. He looked around the kitchen again, but this time the assessment had shifted. He was seeing the hand-knitted dish towels, the jars of dried herbs from the garden, the drawings Leo had made that Eli had taped to the refrigerator, the schedule Henry had posted with everyone's name in his careful teacher's handwriting. He asked how many people lived here, his voice dropping to something quieter, something closer to the frequency he had used as a boy when he asked Maggie questions at the job site. Maggie spoke for the first time. 12, not counting them. David asked if they had all just showed up. Maggie told him everyone needed somewhere to go. They had somewhere. David rubbed his face with both hands. He said he didn't know how to fix this. Maggie's response landed like a plumb line. She told him this wasn't his to fix. This wasn't broken. He stood. He moved toward the corridor and stopped at the doorway of the nearest converted cell. He looked at the wooden door frame where iron bars had been, at the deadbolt on the inside of the bed, and the shelf and the curtain in the window. He put his hand on the door frame. Something crossed his face that Henry recognized from decades of watching children encounter a truth they weren't ready for but couldn't avoid. David asked if Maggie had built all of this. Most of it, she told him. She'd had help. He stood there with his hand on the wood his mother had cut and fitted and sanded. Then he offered to have his attorney look into licensing requirements. There might be a way to formalize the arrangement. Henry told him they didn't need his attorney. David pushed back gently. He said they might whether they wanted his help or not. The county would eventually ask questions about zoning and occupancy. He asked them to let him do at least that much. He walked out, got into the SUV, sat behind the wheel for a full minute without starting the engine. Then he drove away down the gravel road, and Maggie watched from the steps until the dust cloud thinned to nothing. Henry stood behind her in the corridor. He said David was scared. Maggie turned. She asked what David could possibly be scared of. Henry's answer came from the place where observation and empathy intersect. He told her David was scared of what they had built without him, and of what that said about who he was. That evening the phone rang. Henry answered. Lisa's voice came through thick and broken, the sound of someone who has been crying for a while and has decided to call before the courage runs out. She said she had seen the article. She said she was sorry, repeating it like a word she was trying to make mean enough. She said she had wanted to call, kept telling herself she would. And then David told her not to, and she let him decide. She let him decide for all of them, and she was sorry. Henry sat on the edge of the bed in their room, the room that had been a cell, the bed Maggie had built, the curtain he had hung on the first night, the wedding photograph on the shelf. He asked Lisa if she was all right. Lisa couldn't understand how he was asking about her when he was the one living in a jail. Henry told her he was living in his home with people he loved and he was asking about her. Lisa cried for a while longer. Henry listened without interrupting, because listening was the thing he had always been best at, better even than teaching. Finally, she asked if she could come visit, if she could bring the children. Henry's answer arrived without pause. He told her the door was open. It always had been. He hung up and sat in the quiet. Maggie came in and sat beside him. He told her Lisa was coming. Maggie took his hand. Good, she said, and the single syllable contained an entire theology of forgiveness, which is that forgiveness is not a feeling, but a door you choose to leave unlocked. The non-profit paperwork went through in April. A lawyer in the county seat had seen the coverage and offered to handle the filing pro bono. They registered as the Open Door Community Home. Henry filled out the forms at the kitchen table, wearing his reading glasses, the same pair Maggie had packed in the suitcase on that first morning. Tessa earned her GED in May. Henry had tutored her for 4 months every morning before breakfast, working through math problems and reading comprehension exercises with the patient repetition of a man who had never given up on a student and was not about to start with one who had given up on herself. The day the results arrived, Tessa walked into the kitchen holding the letter with an expression Henry had never seen on her face, open and undefended, the face of someone who has just discovered that they are capable of something they had been told they weren't. She had scored in the 92nd percentile in reading. Ruth embraced her. Eli shook her hand. The veteran who rarely spoke told her she had earned it, and the 3 words from him carried more weight than a speech from anyone else. Henry put the letter on the refrigerator next to Leo's drawings and the meal schedule, and a photograph someone had taken on Christmas Eve of all of them at the long table. He asked Tessa what she wanted to do next. She looked at the letter on the refrigerator, and then at Maggie, who was leaning in the doorway with sawdust on her shoulders and a pencil behind her ear. Tessa said she wanted to go to school, real school. She wanted to study building trades. Maggie nodded once. She told Tessa she would write her a recommendation. She had been her teacher for 5 months. She had things to say. Tessa enrolled at the community college in the fall, driving there in an old sedan with bad paint and reliable brakes that June found for $200 and declared mechanically sound. With the authority of a woman, whose mechanical opinions were not suggestions. Ryan called on a Sunday evening in late spring. His voice was tentative. The voice of a man testing whether a bridge he damaged will still hold his weight. He didn't explain the disconnected number or the months of silence. Henry didn't ask. Ryan had found his way through whatever he had been carrying. And Henry knew from experience that people who survive difficult passages don't always want to narrate the journey. They just want to be on the other side. Ryan called every Sunday after that. He sent money monthly always to Henry's account, never through David. He asked about the garden, the residence Maggie's latest project. He was present in the way he could be present from 3,000 miles away. And Henry accepted it because acceptance was not the same as settling. It was the recognition that people love in the shapes they are capable of, and the shape matters less than the fact. Lisa came in June. She drove up the gravel road in a minivan with her 2 children in the back, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7. She parked in front of the building and sat in the car for a long time. Henry watched from the kitchen window. He did not go outside. He waited because he understood that what Lisa needed was not to be met but to arrive on her own terms in her own time. She got out. She looked at the garden and the fire escape and the sign and the window boxes Eli had planted with flowers and the porch Maggie had built with 2 rocking chairs and a bench. She looked at the front door, which was open. She walked in. Her children held her hands. They stood in the corridor looking at the cream-colored walls and the light fixtures and the row of wooden doors. Lisa called for Henry. He came out of the kitchen drying his hands on a towel. He looked at his daughter standing in the corridor with a grandchild on each side. Neither spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to hold everything that had happened between them and everything that hadn't. Lisa's voice broke on the second word when she greeted him. Henry told her to come in. He mentioned lemonade. They sat at the long table. The grandchildren drank lemonade and ate cookies Eli had baked that morning. Ruth showed them the garden. Tessa let the boy try the handsaw in the workshop with Maggie standing directly behind him, her hands hovering near his, guiding the blade the way she had guided David's hands when he was the same age, teaching him to cut a straight line. After lunch, Lisa and Henry walked the building together. Room by room, Henry told her about each person who lived there, where they had come from, what they had lost, what they were constructing from the loss. When they reached his and Maggie's room, Lisa stopped in the doorway. She looked at the bed and the curtain and the photograph on the shelf. She put her hand on the doorframe. She told Henry she needed to say something, and she needed him to hear it. She told him she had known from the beginning. When David made the plan, she knew it wasn't temporary. She knew he wouldn't call. She knew, and she chose to look away because looking away was easier than standing up. And she had built her entire life around the principle that easier was the same as better. She pressed her forehead against the wood of the doorframe and her shoulders shook. Henry was quiet. Then he told her he knew. He had known that morning in the kitchen on Barker Street. He had seen it in her eyes. She had known, and she was ashamed. He told her he wasn't going to say it was fine. It wasn't fine. It had hurt. It still hurt. But she was here. She had come. Was that enough? He paused. It was a start, he told her. He let her feel the weight of it. He didn't reach for her. He didn't soften it. He let it sit because Henry understood that the only honest response to real damage is to acknowledge it without minimizing it, and that repair begins not with comfort, but with truth. Lisa stayed 3 days. She helped Eli with Leo. She weeded the garden with Ruth. She sat in the workshop and watched Maggie build the way she used to watch as a girl Saturday mornings. The smell of sawdust and coffee, the sound of a blade moving through wood. On the last morning, her son asked Maggie if he could come back and learn more about the saw. Maggie told him anytime. She would teach him everything she knew. Lisa started coming monthly, then bi-weekly. She brought groceries and books for Henry's reading group. She never mentioned David. David never returned. Henry didn't expect him to. Some people need years to confront what they have done, and some never manage it at all. He didn't hate his son. He couldn't. He had spent 40 years loving David before spending months being wounded by him. But he stopped waiting for the phone to ring, and that absence of waiting was its own form of peace. By autumn, the open door had become something the town relied on. June sent people there when they walked into her store with the look of someone who has run out of options. The pastor referred families. The county social services office began calling Henry directly when someone needed emergency placement. Maggie kept building. She added the wraparound porch-covered structure on the garden side with benches and an outdoor table for warm weather meals. She built a play area for Leo. She built bookshelves for Henry's reading room. She was 77 now. Her knees announced themselves every morning. Her back negotiated with her throughout the day. She dropped things sometimes because her grip was losing the argument with time. But she kept working because working was how Maggie Holloway understood the world. You measured, you cut, you assembled, and when it was done, it held. On a Thursday in October, almost exactly 1 year after Maggie and Henry had first stood in front of the abandoned jail and seen something other than ruin, a car pulled onto the gravel road. An elderly man and a woman a few years younger got out. He was maybe 70. She held a small suitcase in one hand and her husband's arm with the other. His face carried an expression Maggie recognized instantly because she had worn it herself 12 months ago. The expression of someone trying to understand how the ground had shifted beneath them while they were standing still. Henry went outside. He asked if he could help. The woman spoke. "Their son," she started, and then paused because the sentence that followed was one she had not yet said aloud, and saying it would make it true in a way that thinking it had not. She told Henry they were supposed to stay at their son's place in the city, but when they arrived, the locks had been changed. He wouldn't answer his phone. Someone at the church had told them about this place. Henry looked at them. The suitcase, the confusion, the careful, quiet dignity of two people holding themselves together through an act of will because the alternative was to come apart in a stranger's driveway. He knew them, not their names or their history, but the architecture of their loss. He told them to come inside. He would put the kettle on. He walked them through the corridor, past the rooms where lives had been rebuilt from raw materials, past the kitchen where Eli was feeding Leo in the high chair Maggie had built, past the reading room where Tessa was studying for midterms, past the garden door where Ruth was pulling the last tomatoes of the season from vines that had given more than anyone expected. He took them upstairs to a room on the second floor. Clean bed, warm blankets, a window with a view of the garden and the hills that rolled beyond it in shades of amber and rust. The woman set her suitcase down and looked around the room. She told Henry this was very kind of him. His response was gentle and precise. He told her it was a room, but it could be a home if she let it. That evening, 16 people sat at the long table for dinner. Maggie stood at the head and spoke briefly because she was not a woman who wasted words on ceremonies when the ceremony was the meal itself and the people sharing it. She told them that a year ago she and Henry had 2 suitcases and $6. They didn't know what they were doing. Most days they still didn't. A few quiet laughs moved around the table. Then she said the thing she had been building toward without knowing it, the way she built everything by feel and by structure, and by the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent making things stand. She told them they didn't rescue anyone. They just left the door open. Everyone here rescued themselves. She sat down. Henry reached for her hand under the table. After dinner, the two of them sat on the porch in the rocking chairs. The October air was cool against their faces. The garden was brown and gold spent, but not finished holding the seeds of next year's growth in soil that Henry had turned and tended. Lights glowed in the windows behind them, and the sounds of dishes being washed and people talking, and Leo laughing at something Ruth had done carried through the stone walls and settled around them like weather. Henry took the photograph from his wallet. He had carried it every day for a year. The edges softened the colors, fading slightly, but the image clear. Maggie in her mother's dress, Henry in the borrowed vest. Both of them young and certain and grinning at a future they couldn't see but believed in completely. Maggie looked at it. She told Henry they looked so young, so sure about everything. She asked if they had been right. Henry looked over his shoulder at the building behind them. The lights in every window. The iron bars on the ground floor, where someone had planted morning glories in the spring, and the vines had climbed the bars all summer, winding through the iron covering it in green. The flowers were gone now with the season, but the vines held, and in the evening light, the bars looked less like a cage and more like a trellis. Which is what happens when something built to contain is given a different purpose by someone who refuses to see it as permanent. He told her they were right about the only thing that mattered. Maggie nodded. She set the photograph on the arm of the rocking chair between them, where they could both see it. They sat together on the porch of the building they had bought for $6 and filled with people and purpose and 14 doors that opened from the inside. The evening settled around them. The gravel road stretched away into the dark. Behind them, through the open doorway, the corridor was lit and warm and occupied by people who had found in a place built to hold prisoners the first unlocked room of their lives. The door behind them was open. It always was.